Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including the Boston Globe's Hiawatha Bray discussing his first novel, Power in the Blood, with Paul Makashima, and our book club, which is reading The Office of Historical Corrections on Monday. Hiawatha's event is tomorrow, actually. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, 5 Tuesdays in Winter. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section and we will get to as many questions as we can. We're very excited to welcome back Lily and Julie. We've had them both before and they are both a delight. I want to tell you a little bit about them and then I will turn the event over to them. Lily King is the New York Times bestselling author of 5 novels, including most recently Writers and Lovers and Euphoria. Her work has won numerous prizes and awards, including the Kirkus Prize, the New England Book Award for Fiction, the Maine Book Award for Fiction, a MacDowell Fellowship, a Whitting Award, and she has been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Penn Hemingway Award. Tonight's book, 5 Tuesdays in Winter, has already garnered praise as one of NPR's best books of 2021, a most anticipated book of fall by Vogue, Time, Esquire, People, The Washington Post, and LitHub, a November Indie Next Pick, one of Entertainment Weekly's must-read books of November, and one of Good Morning America's 15 books to curl up with this November, and People's Book of the Week. Lily's first short story was published in Glimmer Train in 1991. Other stories, essays, and reviews have since appeared in a variety of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue, the Los Angeles Review of Books, One Story, Harvard Review, Plowshares, and several anthologies. Her novels have been published in 20 languages. Lily has taught English and creative writing at several universities and high schools in this country and abroad. She grew up in Massachusetts and currently lives in Portland, Maine with her husband, who she actually met in Belmont, Massachusetts, 2 daughters, and 2 dogs. Julia Glass is the author of 5 previous books of fiction, including the best-selling 3 Junes, winner of the National Book Award, and I See You Everywhere, winner of the Binghamton University John Gardner Fiction Book Award. Other published works include the Kindle single Chairs in the Rafters and essays in several anthologies. A recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, Julie is a distinguished writer in residence at Emerson College. She was also the previous winner of the William Faulkner William Wisdom Creative Writing Competition. Julie was born in Boston, grew up in Belmont and Lincoln, and now lives with her family in Marblehead, Massachusetts. And without further ado, I will turn the event over to Lily and Julie.
Thank you, Stacy. So, Lily, this is such a pleasure. I don't know if you remember this, but we met, and it's the last time we saw each other, the first time we saw each other, which was about 10 years ago at the Maine Festival of the Book. And we sat next to each other to sign books. Yes. And I think that for whatever reason, we maybe weren't signing as many books as some other people. So we really got to chat and found a lot of odd connections, I think. But so you were there for Father of the Rain, which yes. I bought and took home. I was there for The Widower's Tale.
Yes, which I brought home and
okay.
loved.
Yeah, well, I love Father of the Rain. And also, Marblehead, of course, is on the North Shore. And, you had told me that you grew up in Manchester by the Sea, and that's very much the setting. And it's not all that usual that one reads books kind of set in this part of Massachusetts. So that was an extra pleasure. But then, you've certainly had, all your novels have been a great success. Euphoria, amazing. Your book about, Margaret Mead in Papua New Guinea. And then, they're sort of in prime pandemic, Writers and Lovers came out. And, I, like a lot of people, and I might ask you a little about what it was like for you, but I really couldn't read I really could not read books. I could read all the bad news in the New York Times for those first few months. And I have to tell you that Writers and Lovers was one of the first books that I read after this, period of just being unable to. And it was also, so it coincided, it was probably April, May, when the weather just got nice enough for me to be able to sit on my little back porch in the sun and read it. And I have such, when I think of that book, and I loved it so much, I just think of the pleasure it gave me that, oh my God, I can read again, you know? So that book has this very special place in my COVID heart, maybe, I don't know. In any case, so when Stacy invited me a couple of months ago to you know, MC this event, I was just like, oh, I can't wait. And I got to read this book, I think before just about anybody else. I got a very early copy, and it just blew me away. And so I was telling everybody, this is the book you have to read. And they're like, what? You know, five, you know, and of course, then, you know, came all the praise, and people were like, have you heard of this book? I said, yeah, I told you about that book a month ago. So, and I think, you know, obviously people have thought of you as a novelist, though now I understand from Stacy's reading of your biography that this, you know, it's not like you suddenly became a short story writer during COVID and turned out these amazing and very varied stories. They were accumulating.
Yeah.
That's kind of, you know, because I you know, I just hadn't happened to intersect with your short stories in any journals or magazines.
No.
So, and it's, this collection of stories is, you know, it kind of reminds me of the Whitman samplers my grandmother used to send at Christmas. And, you know, every story is so rich and delicious, and they're all different. I mean, there's a common cosmos for these characters for the most part, but they're really, each one is its own creature. So anyway, I would love to, I know we were talking, you don't read a lot on Zoom, but I would love to hear you read a passage or, you know, a scene from one of the stories.
Yeah, I would love to. First of all, just thank you so much for doing this. I know how time consuming it is, and it is, you know, I'm just so grateful and so honored that you agreed to it. And I'm a huge fan and have been for so many years. And so it really is a pleasure. And thank you so much, Belmont Books, too, for having me. I do have a soft spot in my heart for Belmont, Mass, because it is where I met my husband. So I thought that I would read from the title story, 5 Tuesdays in Winter. I'm just going to read it kind of 2.5 pages, basically, or maybe less. And it's a bookseller love story, this story, and it's kind of as feel good as I get. So it's a love story. Mitchell's daughter, who was 12, accused him of loving his books but hating his customers. He didn't hate them. He just didn't like having to chat with them or lead them to very clearly marked sections. If they couldn't read signs, why were they buying books? While they complained that nothing was arranged by title. He would have liked to have a bouncer at the door, a man with a rippled neck who would turn people away or quietly remove them when they revealed too much ignorance. His daughter loved the customers. She sat behind the counter at the cash drawer every Saturday, writing up receipts in an illegible imitation of his own microscopic hand and chatting like an innkeeper. She was too tall and too sophisticated for a Maine preteen. She made him uneasy. She'd recently learned the word reticent and used it on him constantly. Isn't he the most reticent person you've ever met? She asked Kate, his only other employee. Maybe not the very most, Kate said, not looking up from her pricing. But that's enough, Paula, he said, then feeling an unexpected pulse of blood to his cheeks, fled to the stockroom and back. Sorry. Mitchell had good ears, and just before he shut the door behind him, he heard Kate's gentle reprimand. I think, as a rule, people don't like being spoken of them in the third person. He'd hired Kate 3 months ago. She'd recently moved to Portland from San Francisco for a man named Lincoln. They lived in a small apartment in Bayside. On their answering machine, Lincoln sounded high-strung and full of anticipation, as if he only ever expected good news after the beep. Despite her strong resume, Kate had unexpected gaps in her knowledge of books. She had never read The Leopard or The Go-Between. She'd never even heard of Machado de Assis. Once he overheard a customer ask how many lines were in a sestina, and she did not know. She was a reader. She borrowed and returned as many as 10 books a week, but not a speller. On the dupe sheet, she wrote J. Austen, spelled wrong, and F. Dostoevsky, also spelled wrong. At the end of the day, when she stapled the credit card receipts to the ticker tape totals, she didn't always align the edges evenly. She let the mechanical pencils run out of lead. She had thin, sometimes dry lips that she picked at when she was thinking deeply, and that he would have liked to kiss. Wanting to kiss Kate was like wanting a larger savings account for Paula's education, or for one of those infallible computerized postal scales for mail orders. It was a persistent, irritating, useless desire. He had been on 2 dates since Paula's mother left. The first one, over 5 years ago now, had been a setup. A friend of a friend. They'd gone to an Italian restaurant for pasta puttanesca. She'd picked out all of her capers and left them on the lip of her bowl, explaining that she was allergic to shellfish. Then she'd wanted to talk about his wife's departure. The story, his college buddy Brad coming to visit from Australia and leaving 2 weeks later with a box of live lobsters and Mitchell's wife, seemed to arouse her. He couldn't bear to take her out again and lost the mutual friend as a result. Thankfully, others had left him alone. He hadn't been devastated when his wife walked out. People vanished. It had been happening all his life. His mother died when he was 6, his father 9 years later. His best friend from childhood, Aaron, had found a lump on his back. Mitchell himself had spotted it first on the beach, and he was dead by Labor Day. Even his favorite customer, Mrs. White, had died within a few years of the shop's opening. Mitchell stood at the stockroom's one window and watched 3 gulls flap restlessly above the harbor. Thick, broken slabs of ice, the size of mattresses, had been pushed to the shore by the tide. Out farther, beyond the frozen crust, the open water shimmered a luminous summer blue. In these kinds of cold spells, everything seemed confused. Even the gulls overhead seemed lost. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it is a wonderful love story. So one of the things I was thinking about, and I think I like to flatter myself by saying that I was maybe a natural fit to talk to you about your work, was, both of us write about characters, mostly, white people of a certain degree of privilege, if not a great degree of privilege. As I sort of like to joke, none of my characters have to worry about a roof over their head. But no degree of privilege spares people from the most painful passages of life, from confronting mortality, from loss and illness, and certainly heartbreak. And of course, all the growing pains and the intense emotions of adolescence and those early years when we fancy ourselves adults, but the rest of the world knows we're really not. As I like to say, adulthood is sort of like something on a very high shelf, and you're reaching really, really hard to get it, and you almost can, but not quite. And one thing that, certainly reading Father of the Rain, you capture with so much heart and a huge range of emotion what it's like for an adolescent girl to watch her parents' marriage fall apart, her father succumb to alcoholism. And but I noticed in these stories, which, as I said, are quite varied, there are a lot of very young people. There are a lot, even if they're not the main character, there are a lot of adolescents. And of course, Paula is a wonderful 12-year-old and very critical to the plot of 5 Tuesdays. And up to the sort of mid-20s. And that's something in Writers and Lovers. You write about someone, trying to find her feet as an independent adult and a writer. And, for some weird reason, even since way before I was middle-aged, I write about like old people for some reason. I can't for the life of me write about a 15-year-old. But I wanted to ask you, whether you notice that, why is that? It's certainly not because, you're a childish person but what is it about? Does it have to do with your own childhood, or, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I really love I love, ages that are transitions where people are in, coming from one thing into another. And that really attracts me. And so adolescence is definitely one of those periods. And also now I think for me, writing about that period when you're an adult, but you realize you kind of have to get it together, like somewhere in your mid to late 20s or early 30s, there's another transition. And that became the focus of Writers and Lovers. And I think, in Timeline in particular, that
Yeah.
and I feel like Timeline was a little bit of a warm up to writing Writers and Lovers. I didn't
That's exactly,
know
I
it at the
wondered
time.
if that was kind of like the seed that germinated into Writers and
It was.
Lovers.
I didn't feel like it was. And when I did my whole tour of Writers and Lovers, I never mentioned Timeline. But then
Yeah.
when I read it, I was like, oh, I was practicing.
Yeah.
And Creature was practicing a little bit too, just because that is also about someone who eventually becomes a writer. But I love teenagers. I was very eager for my kids to become teenagers, and
Really, most people aren't.
I know. And I was a high school English teacher for years.
Okay.
I love, love, love that age, and it really does. It does interest me.
Yeah.
And I love kids, and I would the whole time I was writing the stories in this book. I was raising kids. Sometimes they were very young, like with the last story. That was written. I rarely write about the time that I'm actually in my life, but that was
Really?
when I had very young children, and I was really trying to figure out how on earth I was going to be a good mother and a good writer at the same time. It just, I just, was flummoxed by that. And that story was definitely an expression of all of my fears about both things,
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's one of the earliest of these stories that you wrote, is it?
Well, yeah, it is one of the earliest. It is, weirdly.
It's so interesting because that story, I mean, stands apart from all the others in that it has, I don't know if you call it a surreal or a fantasy element, but it, and I'm currently, a lot of my graduate students are writing work that has a supernatural element of some kind in it. So I thought that maybe that was the most recent of the stories.
Yeah, I know. And it coming at the end, it kind of feels like it might be, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I feel like it came from some sort of weird hallucination when I hadn't slept in like 3 years, and I was trying to.
It's hallucinatory. That's a better way. It's a hallucinatory story.
Yeah,
it's extremely funny, but it's also a little frightening,
Yeah.
So I was like, why did she let him in? So, the man who comes in the door, and
he starts, shape shifting.
Yeah. So I have to say, some of these stories are about people reckoning with their past, or dealing with having been deserted by a spouse. I mean, 5 Tuesdays is not the only story in which someone's heart has been broken by a spouse walking out the door. That comes up again and again. And also a lot of the young people live almost like rich latchkey children. Their parents are, they may be absent because they're drinking, they may be absent because they're working, but I have to tell you, the story that gave me the most joy, and that I actually think of as a love story, really on a par with 5 Tuesdays, was, now why am I not going to get the story? When in the Dordogne, Dordogne, I thought my jaw would crack from how much I smiled while reading that story.
It's great.
So, and I did not, and at the end, okay, so I'm not going to spoil things for anybody. There are 3 revelations in the story as it goes along, one of which is very dark, and then at the end, one of which is really moving and a little bit sad, and one of which is just like such a gift of joy. I mean, I really wept at the end of that story. And I want to say that
students you're talking about.
No, but what? You you don't know what this I'm talking about? Well, I don't want to give them away. So, but I am going to ask you to read. I would really like you to read one page from that because it's so funny. And so I'm just going to tell people what the story is about. So the point of view is he 15-year-old boy?
Actually 14.
14, right in the middle of
Unless I
it. 14-year-old boy.
Because
who
he's
is
the same age as the person at Creature, and I was trying to avoid.
Oh, okay. Well, I think they go to school together, maybe. But he's what he calls himself the martini baby. His parents had, he has like what 3 older siblings or 2 older siblings, but they're out of the nest. And his parents, he just sort of arrived. He's what in one friend of mine's family, she was called the oops baby. So his parents have to, for reasons you learn, go off to France for the summer. And they hire these 2, kind of bros from the local college to take care of the house. And oh, incidentally, there's this 14-year-old hanging out here. And the way in which they take him under their wing is so, I'm getting goosebumps. I thought, you also, again, you capture these college guys so well. So the scene, I would really just I want you to read a page of their dialogue from 73 to 74. Let me just see. Yeah, so is this the first night that they're in the house?
Yes.
With our narrator? So one of them's named Ed, one's named Grant. I was thinking that maybe if you could read from, so first the boy tells them they cannot, whatever they do, go into his father's study, which is where revelation number 1 happens, but I'm not going to give that away. So one of them says, okay, it's a promise. Could you read from, okay, it's a promise at the top of that page to the end of the dialogue on 74? So, and you can just say what they're doing here.
Okay, it's a promise, Ed said. He shifted his legs and took a swig of beer. So my mother took me to the doctor. Do we have to set this up a little bit or no?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you could say I'm sorry, they're at dinner. It's the first dinner in the house, right? And the guys have like raided the freezer in the basement or heating up like a new chicken noodle casserole or something. They're reveling in this cornucopia of free food that they have in this house. Is this going to work? I love this dialogue. Okay.
And Ed is trying to kind of pull some information out of our narrator, who's 14 and a little
shy,
reticent, and he starts to tell the story about being in love with he's like, well, when I was your age, I was in love with Celia Washburn. So that's all you need to know, really. Right. So, okay, it's a promise, Ed said. He shifted his legs and took a swig of beer. So my mother took me to the doctor because of this jaw ache. And he said I had to stop clenching it so much. And when did I clench it? And I said, whenever I think about a certain girl. And he and the nurse laughed. My mother was out in the waiting room. Then we got to talking about other things. And I told him my mother wouldn't let me play baseball that year because my cousin had gotten clonked on the head in the outfield, the dolt. So when he called my mother in, he told her that I was a little stressed and that she should let me play baseball to unwind. Grant was chuckling. Oh, the shiny knees and long ponytail of Celia Washburn, Ed said. You enamored with anyone? I was, of course, hopelessly, but I shook my head no. Ed hooted. Oh my God, you are a terrible liar. Le pire. Never mind, I'll get it out of you in due time, my pretty. He raised his beer to his lips, then put it down again. So, apart from her, who shall remain nameless for now, what do you think about? What, as Professor Marcus would say, remember this, Grant, makes your heart sing? I felt so uneasy with all this interrogation, but I liked it too. And yet I had no answer. Nothing made my heart sing. Even Becca Salinero didn't make my heart sing. She made it hurt. Nothing makes your heart sing? Ed swung his head to Grant at the stove. What makes your heart sing? Chicken noodle casserole, the full moon and the really thin moon. Sunday mornings, if the New York Times isn't sold out. My nieces and nephews, my blue bicycle, Yates, and Herman Hesse sometimes. Herman Hesse, Le Pire. Narcissus and Goldman, Grant said. Oh, come on. If you have to read a German, read Mann, not that lightweight. 400 pages about a guy wrapped in a camel hair blanket? No thanks. What makes your heart sing, Ed? I ventured. The venerable state of Maine. So why aren't you there now? Oh God, said Grant. It's Disneyland in the summer, unrecognizable. Hollywood, hate it. Well, that was impressively concise. Grant handed me the peas and said, sotto voce, and yet for Ed's benefit, sometimes that topic can go on into the night. Well, I didn't want to scare our boy here right out of the gate.
Thank you. Thank you. So anyway, love that story. And then I have to say, at the other end of the emotional spectrum for me, there are a couple of pretty sad stories. There is, by the way, you know, I did want to mention, but that story, Waiting for Charlie, which I reread today, and I had actually kind of forgotten about reading it the first time around. And I don't know why, because it's so powerful, and it's about a nonagenarian, is he 91-year-old grandfather visiting his 25-year-old granddaughter who's in a coma after a skiing accident in the hospital. And he's so arrogant and yet he's so broken down by the visit. And you see him, you know, looking at his own mortality, but it's the 25-year-old who may die. And it's just the aroma. Anyway, I won't, that story is really heartrending. But the story that I found both riveting and really heartbreaking was Hotel Seattle. And, you know, I write quite often about gay men. And this is a story, of course, about, would you talk a little bit about that story? You know, I'd be curious to know if you remember how it came to you, and maybe tell people in a nutshell what it's about. It's a very, very powerful story.
Yeah, I hate to talk about it too much because I feel like surprise, the element of surprise is in there. And
well, can I, okay, so maybe it,
yeah, okay.
But well, let me see if I could, you know, I mean, it just, since I've opened the can of worms, it's narrated by a man who is looking back on his college life with his roommate, and he had not come out of the closet as gay. He was Catholic. It was very forbidden. He was trying really hard to be straight, dating girls, but getting not much past, you know, a certain connection, while he had this real, you know, handsome, strapping roommate who was his best friend and who could basically have any girl he wanted, you know, married his college sweetheart. And there's this scene at the wedding, but our narrator doesn't come out to anyone. And he has a bunch of brothers. He comes out to them. He comes out to his parents. But he doesn't come out to this roommate until later, you know, on the phone, and it doesn't go well. And the roommate and the former roommate basically drops him. I mean, it's interesting that it isn't that you don't include that conversation. It's just he reacted to it badly. And then the present moment of the story is when some years later, when the narrator is now in a relationship with a man in Seattle, the roommate, who's a businessman, comes to Seattle for a business trip, and they meet for a drink. And it's about what happens when they reconnect.
Yeah.
And it is, but I just, you know, I mean, I'm just, where did it come from? You know, where did it spring from? I guess
what I'm most interested in, I feel, is kind of subverting readers' expectations. And so, you know, you think you're getting one thing, kind of a sweet sort of funny, they're funny little moments, you know, at first. And he's kind of conflicted about the relationship that he's been in, like his first relationship since coming out. And you think you're in one kind of a story, and then you get where they meet, and then it becomes another kind of story. I feel like people have told me that about many stories in this collection. Like when in the Dordogne, people expect those boys to do bad things to that, to that younger kid, and they're like, oh no, and they have their heart in their throat, and and then in Creature, I think you're not expecting what happens, the really,
Yeah, that leads to a pretty,
Yeah.
and again, because you have such a great sense of humor and your characters are often sort of quirky, like is it Mrs. Pike in Creature, who's this
yeah,
sort of grande dame with the
yeah,
rich house, and this young, romantic adolescent girl is sent to be the au pair for the grandchildren of Mrs. Pike. And Mrs. Pike is this, kind of hilarious character. And then something very dark happens, again, because adults are not watching what's going on. They're just, people aren't paying attention.
right.
And it's up to those teenagers to take care of themselves. Just as in Dordogne, if that boy, if those two college guys had decided to go all risky business on the house, then what would he have done to sort of
Yes.
defend the home turf? But something else happens. You're right. It's a different story.
Yeah, I know. He was in a perilous situation, that surprisingly, turns nurturing. And and this is just the opposite in Hotel Seattle. And
Yeah.
um
It's also very,
also tend to write a lot about gay men, and I
you do.
I
Yeah.
couldn't exactly tell you why. I mean, I have certainly gay men and women in my life, but maybe
Yes.
not more than anybody else. But
Right.
I don't know. It's just that one thing. My editor often is like, oh, another gay man. I'm like, yep.
Well, you also, though, sort of against expectations, there's that fabulous bartender character in Timeline. William, is that his name? Who,
Oh yeah.
no,
William.
who is straight,
Yeah.
but wears these gorgeous saris and gowns to his job and is in an open marriage. And he's quite the character as well. But where were we? So I just, I think Hotel Seattle is very daring. I think it's the most daring of all the stories in terms of where you go. And but also, even as it takes you somewhere halfway through, you don't expect to go. The ending is also quite unexpected and very moving.
That was a surprise to me. And
when you were writing it,
when you write those things, and
yeah,
I try not to think about the ending very much, because if I do, it will just scare me. And stories have to really have to come around. You really have to have a good ending for a story, I think. And that was really, really a surprise to me, and a great pleasure, when something happens like that, and you're like,
it's so tender. The story goes
about.
The story goes from a very violent place to a very tender place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that violence needed to happen to get to that moment for him in his life, and for him to, that was necessary.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I didn't know all of that while I was writing the story,
So I was going to ask you at some point, which of these stories surprised you the most, sort of came out of you the most unexpectedly, or took a twist that would that be it?
Strangely, I think it was Timeline, which we haven't talked about, but
talk about Timeline. Timeline has so many things going on in it. I wouldn't quite know how to describe it. Do you want to talk about that one? Do you want to talk about Timeline?
Yeah, I remember it's one of the most recent ones, and I remember the feeling and the pleasure, the real pleasure I had writing that story, and how it really came out of me quite quickly and easily. And it actually, you can see the typewriter. I wrote it on that, and it's the only full piece of fiction that I've written on that typewriter. I got it after Euphoria, and I love it so much. But I have such a habit of writing by pencil, by hand, that I don't.
Really?
But that story I wrote all on the typewriter, and I just felt like that the typewriter, something, it tapped into a different part of my brain, and it feels different stylistically for me than the other stories in some way. And I think maybe what you're saying, it's a chaotic story, and there's a lot of parts, and they're all coming at once, and it's not as controlled as my other things, I think. And part of it, I think, was that typewriter. It was, I don't know, there was something about it that made me more put more things in there, or just play around more. It was just play, because I was playing on this new machine, and it all felt very playful. And I loved that.
Interesting. So maybe you could talk a little bit before we turn it over to questions about North Sea, which is different from the other stories in that it has a foreign setting and it has German characters. And again, you have a mother and adolescent daughter, and the father has been very tragically and suddenly killed in a bicycle accident, leaving the mother with debt, having to work extra hard to support this daughter. And she tries, and the daughter's very sullen, and she tries to do something nice for the daughter by taking her on a holiday that she can hardly afford. And do you want to talk a little bit about that story? And I'm also curious why German,
I know.
why German characters, and why this particular somewhat bleak sounding setting.
Yeah, I will tell you. I'll tell you the origin. That I have a couple that have real origin stories, and
Okay.
this is one of them. And it's funny because I haven't spent a whole lot of time in Germany, but I have lived in Paris for 2 years. I lived in Valencia, Spain for 2 years, and I lived in Italy for a year.
Wow.
And yet, why none of those places came up in my fiction, I have no idea. It's so frustrating to me. But there's Germany. And the reason it was because with Euphoria, my German publisher brought me over for a little German book tour. And
Wow.
one of the places that we went was Hamburg, and I met a mother-daughter, an adult mother-daughter bookseller team. They owned a bookstore together nearby. And I sat with them at a dinner, and the mother told me that when her daughter was younger, like 11, 12, 13, I'm not really sure, her husband had died, her daughter's father had died, and their first vacation was to an island on the North Sea. At least I think that's what she said. I'm not 100% sure. But and she said that they went there and they had a terrible, terrible time. The weather was terrible. They were in full grief, and it was a disaster. And she said, and we went back we go back every year. We've gone back every single year since.
Wow.
And I just thought that was so great. And the daughter confirmed it. And that's all. Like that, literally what I just told you was everything they told me about that. And then a couple of years later, I was on an island during a summer, an island like right over there, a couple of miles. And I was riding my bicycle down a hill, and I remembered that little vignette that they told me. And I suddenly saw the whole story. I spun it all out, like right on my bicycle. And, as soon as I stopped, I wrote what I had come up with down. And then I soon after that, I wrote that story. I spent a lot of time looking at maps of German islands and kind of figuring out where I would put them and what it would be like. And I've lived on an island in Maine for many summers and for a full year one time. So I kind of had a little bit of a sense of island life. But
Yeah.
it was, I was really interested in the mother. She wants them to be able to grieve together and not apart, which is
Right.
so hard and such a, such a difficult situation.
Well, I think also, what emerges in the story is that the daughter has yet to grieve. And the way that comes out is, a shock to the reader and to the mother. Yeah. So yeah, that's a very affecting story. Is there an interesting origin story to Waiting for Charlie, the one about the grandfather in the hospital room?
You know that that I did write that a long time ago. When
Oh,
my husband's cousin was in an accident and was in a coma,
oh,
and I had heard that her grandfather came to visit, and I don't know any of the details, and I didn't know his grandfather very well.
right.
Um, but that's what I was imagining when
Yeah.
I thought of him sitting in her room. And
Wow.
there had been aromatherapy um, on the windowsill. I had seen the bottles, so that was part of that. And then the only other origin story that I think is worth mentioning is When in the Dordogne.
Oh,
That whole concept of my husband and I and our two little girls at the time went to pizza just down the road from me right here. And I ran into a kid that I had not seen since I was 15 or 16 years old. And I didn't know him. We weren't in the same social group all that well, but it was one summer, it was a couple of summers. And
yeah.
and we were catching up really briefly, like a couple of minutes we talked. And for some reason, he said, when I was a teenager, my parents went away for the summer and they got two college kids to take care of our house. And this is what he said. And because I came with the house, they'd had to take care of me too. And I remember hearing that and just thinking, what an such a fascinating way to put that, you know. And I felt like there's everything in that sentence, you know. There's neglect, there's humor, there's privilege. It was like right, it was just delivered to me. Those are all the things I like, you know. Just give that to me and I will play with that. But I didn't write it for years and years afterwards. But somewhere in my brain that sentence was there waiting for me. So
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to him.
Yeah. Well, I see that we're almost at 7:45, and I really hope so that people will ask questions. I feel like in some ways I've managed to create a lot of teasers rather than telling so much, but really each story is a gem unto itself. And I had a great deal of pleasure rereading the book today. That was what I got to do today on a sort of a bleak, rainy day, and it was
so nice.
really a wonderful way to spend the day. So, Stacy, do you want to relay questions to Lily
I
from the
will.
chat?
Yes. So the first question came from Catherine, and I think that you answered a lot of this already, but I'm just going to read it in case there's anything more you want to say about it. Without giving anything away, I'm so curious about whether you knew what the ending of North Sea would be when you started writing it, or did it surprise you? In general, to what extent do you know where your stories are going when you start out? Thanks, loving the book.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine. I did not have any idea, and I really had no idea how I was going to find the ending. I remember kind of just heading out, and these scenes kept coming, but I kept on wondering, okay, when are we going to wrap it up here? and then, you know, and then I got her babysitting toward the end, and then it came to me what would happen. But that was a huge surprise. I did not see that coming, and I often don't with stories. With novels, I feel like I kind of know where I want to end emotionally. I don't often know the details or the any of the plot, but I know kind of where I want the character to land and how I want the character to feel at the end. But not so with stories. I often have no idea, and that's really kind of what's fun with them, is that there's no pressure, and if it doesn't land, it doesn't land, and it stays on my computer for another 5 years until I might turn back to it at some point. So yeah.
Brenda asks, what's the most difficult thing about writing a character nothing like you? For example, characters of different genders, sexual orientation, age, etc.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is that there's the whole Madame Bovary, c'est moi sort of thing where you do, we're all humans, you know, and so I feel like uh I think I give you know, my male characters some of my emotion, or I don't know. I like, I think what I like best when I'm writing is to have certain elements that are very familiar and then certain elements that are very unfamiliar. And there's something about the meeting of those and the collision of those that I don't know, creates the energy for me. And so like with Euphoria, there was a lot of energy for me with um, writing about people who, you know, were living in 1931, and they had traveled to Papua New Guinea, which was so unfamiliar to me. And they were scientists, also extremely unfamiliar to me. I barely studied science in high school. I got away with all kinds of earth sciences and stuff and not having to take chemistry or physics or anything. And and you know, and I was writing in the voice of a man for that novel, and all those unfamiliar things allowed me to tell familiar things like love triangles and falling in love and falling out of love, and trying to do your work um, when it's really hard, and you have all kinds of things working against you trying to do your work. And I don't know. I think that's how sometimes I get inspired by using unfamiliar elements.
Well, we have, I think, 4 separate questions that are all very related to each other. People seem very interested in knowing, do you know when you start writing whether it's going to be a short story or a novel? And how do you decide which ideas will become a short story or a novel?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And usually 99% of the time, I would say when I get an idea, I know immediately whether it's going to be a short story or a novel. The novel ideas feel very big and unmanageable. And my first reaction is no, 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 I will not be doing that. I will not be doing that. I mean, for years, while I was researching Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson and Papua New Guinea, the whole time I was telling myself, I'm not actually writing a novel about that. I'm just curious. I'm just curious. I kept telling myself, like, I'm not actually going to write this. And then I would like write a scene, you know, I'm like, oh, but I'm not writing this novel. So I do that a lot because it just doesn't, I didn't think I could do that. I really did not think that that was something I could take on. And novels are often like that. And they collect a lot of ideas very quickly. You know, I think of them as kind of like magnets, really strong magnets, and suddenly boom, everything is going into it. I'm like, and it's just growing and growing. Whereas with stories, they kind of come in on a wind, and they're small and they're manageable, and I can put them in a container and nothing else gloms onto them when I'm thinking about them. When I'm writing, things start coming, but they're just, you know, they're more like poems, you know, than I don't know. Novels can hold so much, and they can go in many different directions, and there can be mistakes in them, you know. Whereas stories have to be really kind of contained and concise and more perfect, really.
Great. Does anybody else have questions? I don't see
Well,
any right
can
now.
I jump in and ask the sort of too often asked question, but I think everybody wants to know, are you working on another novel? And
Yes.
can we hear anything about it, or is it under wraps?
Well, this is what always happens to me on a book tour. People ask me that question, and I
know it's
say
obnoxious.
And
Yeah.
no, it ends up not being true in the end. Like I never end up writing the novel I think I'm writing on this book tour, you know? So I can tell you that I have like 61 pages of a new novel in like, you know, a notebook by hand. And there seems to be a dead body on the first page, which is very rare for me. And so it seems to be some kind of maybe slightly a murder mystery, or at least it's a mystery for a while. And it's still a mystery for me right now, whose body it is and how they got there. So I'm not really sure. I have some ideas, but it takes place in the summer of 2020, which is also,
Oh,
I don't think I've written anything that's really in the 21st century. I'm still, and so people have cell phones and I haven't done that yet. It's very funny. Like I just, it takes me a long time to write about the time that I'm living in. I'm usually writing from, 20 years in advance. So that's all I know. And it's kind of political.
Oh, can I ask where it's set? Is it set in Maine?
It's on an island in Maine.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll see. Do you want to talk about a little bit about what you have, something like in the hopper?
Well, yeah. So my next novel comes out in May, and it finally has a title. The titles take a long time, but it's called Vigil Harbor, and it takes place. And we'll see how successful this is. It actually takes place about 12 years in the future. And it takes place, and Vigil Harbor is a town on the North Shore of Massachusetts, a very privileged town. People will recognize it probably as Marblehead, where I live. And it's also political, and it's about what happens when a very privileged and a town that's mostly sheltered and insulated from all of the slings and arrows of the world around us, including climate change and political upheaval, when that privilege is penetrated. A couple of strangers come to town just to, and throw things upside down. But it's told from 8 points of view, so 8 alternating voices.
Wow.
And and for me, it actually grew out of, although it didn't end up being as much about as I thought it would be, about living in a town on the ocean at a time when the ocean is in great peril, or our relationship to the ocean, and how much we're able to, life in the ocean. And I'm sure this from living in Maine too, Lily, that things like lobstering and, not just fishing, those vocations are quite under threat. The way of life for people who have lived on the ocean and made a living from the ocean have changed drastically, and it's a dire situation.
No, it is
So
dire.
so there is as I said to someone recently, there's a very depressed marine biologist is one of the characters, and this friend answered, "Don't you think all marine biologists are very depressed right now?"
Yes.
Anyway, so yes, so that comes out in May.
Oh, great. Oh, I can't wait.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to that. Oh, I see one more question here from Brenda for both of you. Is there a question you wish a reader would ask you but never has or rarely has?
You take that, Lily.
Okay. Well, there is something I want to talk about, so I wish somebody would ask me, what's this cover?
Oh, it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
This is part of a painting. It's a detail of a painting that's in my living room. And it's my mother-in-law, my husband's mother, who is just a gorgeous, gorgeous painter. And the whole painting is really beautiful. And it's funny because when we were deciding on covers, they sent me options, and one of them was very beautiful and everybody really liked it at the publishing house, and it was kind of abstract, colorful, and I was like, yeah, this is nice, but and I took a picture of the painting. I'm like, this would be nicer, and they let me do it. I couldn't believe it. It's very, very exciting. And then Julie, I don't know if you probably don't have the hardcover.
I do have the hardcover.
These little drawings.
Oh, I love those little drawings.
My older daughter Kala's idea, because she had done the geese for Writers and Lovers, And I was like, oh, I'm so sad
Oh.
that I don't have like an image that we can put on the front like we did the geese and Writers and Lovers. And she said, just immediately, she was like, well, we could put little drawings on, just below each title. And like, isn't it so cute, the little paper clip? I mean,
Yes.
and,
So what is this? Are those, my eyes are terrible.
They're
What are
pins.
these?
They're
They're those children's like water wings.
Not water wings. They're for the feet.
Oh no. Oh, feet. Oh, they're flippers. Okay.
They're flippers, exactly. And anyway, I love them. And then I'll just
And
say,
I noticed
family.
my
other daughter, my younger daughter, did the author.
I noticed that. That's, yeah, very
I know.
cool.
So got everybody in there except my husband.
No, he doesn't feel left out.
No, he's okay, I think, with it.
Julie, did you want to answer that question as well?
No. I mean, if I were the one talking about my book, I'd probably come up with something. But you know what? It's always nice to be asked what you wish you could be asked, so that if it is sitting there at the forefront and you're just wishing it would be asked, that it gets asked. Thank you, Brenda. Brenda is actually a friend of mine. So and also a wonderful writer who lives on Martha's Vineyard, another island. So
beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I would like to say thank you so much, Lily and Julie. This was a wonderful conversation. I think everybody really enjoyed it. And thank you, everybody who came for it. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you to my students and friends who are out there in the audience. I really appreciate your coming.
Thank you, Julie.
Have a great night.
Thank you,
everyone.
Lily. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy,
Thank
and
you.
everybody at Belmont Books.
Take good care, everyone.
You
Good
too.
night.
You too.